Right now, in the waters north of occupied Kerch, Russian oil tankers are burning. Not one, not two. Over the past 4 days, Ukrainian drone crews have struck 35 vessels belonging to Russia's so-called shadow fleet in the Sea of Azov. And the footage coming out of this operation looks less like isolated skirmishes and more like a hunting ground. Ships on fire, smoke columns rising off the water, crews evacuating burning tankers in the middle of the night. This is not a metaphor. This is happening, night after night, in one of the most concentrated maritime strike campaigns of the entire war. And the man leading it isn't shy about what he thinks it means. Robert Brovdi, the commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, known across the front by his call sign Madyar, posted a simple, defiant line on Telegram as this operation unfolded. Moscow will fall. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's happening in the Sea of Azov, why Russia's fuel supply to occupied Crimea is now hanging by a thread, how this campaign connects to a much bigger strategy to sever the peninsula from Russia entirely, and why Crimea has already been forced to declare a state of emergency because of it. Stay until the end, because this isn't just a story about burning ships. It's a story about how Ukraine is trying to win a war without ever crossing the front line. Let's start with the basic mechanics of what's actually happening out there, because the phrase shadow fleet gets thrown around a lot without much explanation. Since Western sanctions cut off much of Russia's access to normal international shipping and insurance markets, Moscow has relied on what's become known as a shadow fleet, a sprawling collection of aging tankers, often flagged under other countries with murky ownership structures, all designed to keep Russian oil moving around the world despite the sanctions regime. Industry estimates suggest this shadow fleet has grown to more than 1,500 tankers globally, allowing Russia to keep exporting oil even while facing some of the heaviest sanctions any modern economy has ever encountered. A portion of that fleet has a much more localized, and for Ukraine, much more strategically important job, hauling fuel across the Sea of Azov into occupied Crimea, keeping the peninsula's military garrison, its vehicles, its aircraft, and its infrastructure running. That's the specific route Ukraine has now decided to systematically dismantle. The operation began on the night of July 6th into the 7th, when Ukrainian drones hit an initial wave of Russian tankers hauling gasoline across the Azov Sea toward Crimea. Brovdi described the results in blunt terms, saying the strikes produced what he called industrial-scale results, with fuel tankers badly damaged and left on fire. According to his count, that first wave alone included 8 Shadow Fleet tankers, a dry cargo ship, and a ferry. He added a detail that mattered just as much as the strike numbers themselves. All the identified tankers were confirmed to be under international sanctions, aging vessels with a dead weight of roughly 7,000 metric tons each, about 140 meters long, and built between 2006 and 2012. In other words, these weren't ambiguous targets caught in the crossfire. These were specifically identified, sanctioned vessels, and Brovdi's team named several of them directly, including tankers called Venera 3, Sonar 1, Sonar 17, Clemens, and Penelope. Then came Night 2. On July 7th into the 8th, Ukrainian forces hit 9 more Shadow Fleet tankers in the same waters. That brought the running total, according to Brovdi, to 21 vessels struck over 72 hours, broken down as 19 sanctioned tankers, 1 cargo ship, and 1 ferry hit in Kerch. Satellite monitoring backed up the claims independently. NASA's FIRMS wildfire tracking system, which detects thermal anomalies from space, logged fresh heat signatures in the waters north of Kerch and near Russia's Taganrog, precisely where the strikes were reported. Separately, the open-source monitoring channel Exylanova Plus published satellite imagery appearing to show Russia deliberately driving damaged, sanctioned tankers into the occupied port of Kerch, with the channel noting the vessels were leaking and polluting the surrounding waters. This is important context because it tells you Ukraine's claims in this specific case weren't just self-reported numbers from a Telegram channel. They were corroborated by independent satellite data, which is about as close to real-time verification as open-source war reporting gets, and the operation kept escalating. Overnight on July 8th into the 9th, Ukraine's drone forces struck 14 more vessels, including 12 tankers, 1 cargo ship, and 1 tug, pushing the 4-day cumulative total to 35 ships. Brovdi's own day-by-day breakdown paints a picture of an operation building in intensity rather than fading. 2 tankers hit on the 6th, 10 vessels on the 7th, 9 more on the 8th, 14 on the 9th. Some vessels were even struck twice, including ones identified as Sonar 17 and Clemens, suggesting Ukrainian forces are tracking and re-engaging damaged ships, rather than simply hitting targets once and moving on. On the Russian side, regional officials have partially confirmed the scale of what's happening, even while downplaying it. Rostov Oblast. Governor Yuri Slusar acknowledged that drones struck 2 tankers in Taganrog Bay, saying the vessels sustained mechanical damage, that crews were evacuated, and that fires broke out on both ships, though he claimed no one was injured. That's a Russian regional governor on Russian state channels, independently confirming burning tankers in Russian-controlled waters. When your own officials are confirming fires on your own ships, the story isn't really in dispute anymore. Not everyone in this story is confirming things quite so readily. Russian-installed Crimea governor Sergei Aksionov offered a very different framing, claiming Russian air defenses had successfully stopped 4 separate attacks and shot down 27 drones, insisting no casualties had been reported. It's worth including that counterclaim, honestly, because it reflects how contested even the scale of damage is between the two sides. Ukraine's own drone forces stated plainly that striking Russia's naval logistics complicates the resupply of fuel and ammunition needed to sustain Russian troop activity, primarily in occupied Crimea. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. Russian air defenses likely did intercept a portion of the incoming drones, and Ukraine likely still landed a significant number of confirmed hits, backed by satellite thermal data and a Russian governor's own admission of burning ships in his region's waters. War reporting rarely comes with a single, undisputed number, and viewers deserve to know that rather than being handed an inflated figure dressed up as absolute fact. Now here's where this campaign connects to something much bigger than burning tankers. This isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a coordinated effort that Ukrainian forces have internally nicknamed Operation Crimean Switch, aimed at systematically cutting off occupied Crimea's power grid, fuel supply, and military logistics all at once. Alongside the tanker strikes, Brovdi reported that Ukrainian drones hit 6 more Russian electrical substations on the night of July 8th alone, bringing the total number of energy facilities targeted between July 1st and July 8th to 50. 50 energy nodes in just over a week. On the night of July 9th, Ukrainian strikes reportedly hit 45 additional military targets across occupied Crimea and southern occupied Ukraine, including the Saki thermal power plant, 3 separate fuel depots, a Zatel electronic warfare jamming system, and multiple communications towers. In the occupied part of Kherson Oblast, the Russian-installed occupation administration itself reported a power outage that same night. Ukraine's security service, the SBU, added its own layer to this campaign, confirming strikes on the Jankoy military airbase, targeting relay stations used for Russian Orion strike reconnaissance drones, along with weapons and equipment depots. The SBU also confirmed hits on Port Krim infrastructure in occupied Kerch, ammunition and fuel depots in the villages of Novohrihorivka and Chervony, and a logistics hub near Pokrovsk, stocked with drones, ground robotic systems, and ammunition. According to the agency, these strikes killed multiple Russian drone pilots and unit commanders, though, as with most battlefield casualty claims from either side, that specific figure has not been independently verified. The human impact of this campaign, from Russia's own occupied territory, is becoming difficult for Moscow to hide. A resident of Jankoy, posting in a local Telegram channel called Typical Jankoy, complained that the area had been left without electricity for days on end. That's not a Ukrainian military claim. That's an actual resident of Russian-occupied Crimea, describing the on-the-ground consequences of this campaign in real time. And the fuel side of the crisis has become serious enough that Crimean authorities have reportedly declared a state of emergency on the peninsula, a striking admission given how consistently Russian and Russian-installed officials have downplayed the impact of Ukrainian strikes throughout this war. According to reporting, Ukraine's targeting of logistics, bridges, major highways, and energy infrastructure across Crimea in recent weeks has directly contributed to fuel shortages severe enough to trigger that declaration. Separate reporting has also noted that Russia has already lost access to almost 100 petrol stations as a result of this broader pressure campaign, a detail that underscores just how deep this fuel crisis is starting to cut into daily civilian and military life on the peninsula. Let's talk about why this specific strategy, targeting fuel tankers rather than just military hardware, matters so much. Serhiy Kuzan, chairman of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center and a military and political analyst specializing in Russian strategy, explained the thinking behind this campaign to the Kyiv Independent. According to Kuzan, this is fundamentally about weakening the enemy's capabilities by striking directly at their logistics, with the ultimate goal of ensuring Crimea can no longer function as a rear base for the entire southern grouping of Russian forces. He added that the situation on the peninsula is deteriorating for both the civilian population and the occupying military, though he noted the military still has an easier time of it, since resources are effectively being diverted away from civilians and funneled towards sustaining the occupying forces instead. That's the strategic logic in a nutshell. You don't need to defeat Russia's army in a single battle if you can slowly strangle the fuel, power, and supply lines that let that army function at all. Every tanker that doesn't make it across the Azov Sea is fuel that doesn't reach a Russian vehicle, aircraft, or generator in occupied Crimea. There's also a broader pattern here worth understanding, because Ukraine's targeting of Russia's oil infrastructure isn't limited to the Sea of Azov. In the same window as this tanker campaign, Ukrainian drones reportedly struck a major Russian oil refinery roughly 500 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory in Krasnodar Krai, one of the largest refineries in southern Russia, producing nearly 6.6 million tons of fuel annually. Separately, a key Russian oil refinery in the city of Saratov reportedly halted processing entirely on July 8th, following a Ukrainian drone strike on the facility, according to Reuters, citing undisclosed sources. Put together, you have a picture of Ukraine running a multi-pronged campaign against Russia's fuel infrastructure simultaneously, refineries deep inside Russian territory, tankers in the Azov Sea, and fuel depots inside occupied Crimea itself. This isn't a single dramatic strike designed for a news cycle. It's a sustained, coordinated effort to inflict what analysts have described as a genuine domestic fuel supply crisis inside Russia and its occupied territories. It's worth putting Ukraine's naval drone capability itself into context too, because a few years ago, an operation like this would have sounded almost impossible. Russia's Black Sea fleet once had overwhelming conventional naval superiority near Ukraine's coastline. That's no longer the operational reality. Ukraine's defense intelligence has pointed to maritime drones, particularly the Madyar Vi-5 model, as providing a decisive strategic advantage in the Black Sea against Russia's larger, more conventional fleet. With a reported range of roughly 800 kilometers, these drones can reach well into the Azov Sea itself, though Ukrainian officials have reportedly remained cautious about exactly how and when they deploy them. Russia's own naval posture has shifted in response to this growing threat. Reports indicate Russia has moved its Kaliber missile-carrying vessels out of the Black Sea entirely, attempting to place them beyond the reach of Ukrainian naval drones. As one piece of battlefield analysis put it bluntly regarding those relocated ships, they can run, but they can't hide, a nod to just how far Ukraine's long-range strike and drone capability has expanded geographically, even against vessels trying to stay out of range. This kind of pressure campaign isn't happening without cost or risk to Ukraine either, and it's worth being upfront about that, since a one-sided narrative rarely reflects the full picture of any active war. Russia has continued launching its own large-scale strikes against Ukrainian territory throughout this same period, including an overnight barrage of 137 attack drones that Ukraine's Air Force reported intercepting or engaging on a single night. Separately, Russian strikes across Ukraine killed at least 9 people and injured at least 77 more, including a deadly strike in Donetsk Oblast, according to Ukrainian officials. According to Ukraine's general staff, cumulative Russian troop losses since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022 have surpassed 1.4 million, though that figure includes killed, wounded, and captured personnel combined, and should be understood as a broad attritional estimate rather than a precise death toll. The point isn't to draw a false equivalency between burning oil tankers and Russian missile strikes on civilian areas. It's to be honest that this remains a brutal, two-directional war, and that Ukraine's successes in the Sea of Azov are unfolding at the same time Russia continues inflicting real civilian casualties elsewhere in the country. So what does all of this actually add up to? Over 4 consecutive nights, Ukrainian drone forces struck 35 vessels tied to Russia's Shadow Fleet operation, supplying occupied Crimea, corroborated not just by Ukrainian military claims, but by satellite thermal imaging, open-source geolocation, and even a Russian regional governor's own admission of burning ships in his territory's waters. That maritime campaign is run in parallel with strikes on 50 energy facilities across Crimea in little more than a week, attacks on a major military airbase, an ammunition and fuel depot network, and refinery strikes reaching hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. The cumulative effect, according to Ukrainian officials and independently reported on-the-ground accounts from residents inside occupied Crimea, has been rolling blackouts, fuel rationing, and a declared state of emergency on the peninsula. None of this guarantees a fast end to the war, and Russian-installed officials continue disputing the scale of the damage. But taken together, it represents one of the most sustained, multi-domain pressure campaigns Ukraine has run against Russian-occupied territory throughout the entire conflict, hitting the fuel, the power, and the military logistics holding Crimea together, all at the exact same time. There's also a legal and diplomatic dimension to this campaign that's worth understanding, because Russia hasn't just been absorbing these strikes quietly. Moscow has publicly accused Kiev of carrying out what it calls terrorist attacks against commercial shipping, a serious accusation in international maritime law. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Oleksiy Kuleba, responded directly to that accusation in a formal letter to the International Maritime Organization, according to reporting from the Financial Times. In that letter, Kuleba pushed back on the idea that these Shadow Fleet vessels should be treated as ordinary commercial ships at all, arguing there are legitimate questions about whether their activities can really be considered standard commercial operations given their role in funding Russia's war effort while evading international sanctions. Ukraine's broader legal position throughout this campaign has been that tankers transporting Russian oil and petroleum products are directly financing Moscow's invasion, and therefore may constitute legitimate military targets rather than protected civilian shipping. That's a significant legal argument, and it's one the International Maritime Organization and various Western governments will likely continue debating as this campaign continues, since it touches on core questions about how far a country can legally go in targeting an adversary's sanctioned commercial fleet during wartime. It's also worth comparing this Azov Sea operation to Ukraine's previous naval strike campaigns because the scale here is genuinely unusual. By comparison, the Ukrainian Navy reportedly damaged 6 Russian tankers operating off Turkey's northern coast and in the Mediterranean over an entire 3-week period in late 2025. That's 6 ships in 3 weeks, roughly the pace of 2 ships per week. The Sea of Azov campaign, by contrast, produced 35 ships in just 4 days. That's not an incremental increase, that's an entirely different order of magnitude, and it reflects both the concentration of shadow fleet traffic in these specific waters, supplying Crimea, and the improved reach and coordination of Ukraine's long-range drone units compared to a year earlier. Kuleba's letter to the IMO also noted, for balance, that Russia has attempted its own attacks on Ukrainian and international commercial shipping throughout the war, citing a December 2025 report from the Institute for Black Sea Strategic Studies, estimating that Russia attempted between 15 and 18 attacks on Ukrainian commercial shipping in 2025 alone, damaging around 28 vessels. Kuleba specifically pointed to incidents involving the Turkish cargo ship MV Victress and the German-owned vessel Helga as examples, arguing these incidents demonstrate Moscow's own disregard for international humanitarian law and maritime safety, separate from an earlier still disputed incident involving the Russian-flagged tanker Arctic Metagaz in the Mediterranean back in March, which Russia blamed on Ukraine and which Kiev has denied any involvement in. Including these details matters because it shows that maritime attacks in this war have not been a one-directional Ukrainian campaign against innocent Russian shipping. Both sides have targeted commercial vessels connected to the other's war effort, and the legal and diplomatic arguments over where the line sits between legitimate military target and protected civilian shipping remain genuinely unresolved. Let's also talk briefly about what independent open-source monitoring is showing beyond just the strike counts, because this is a rare case in this war where private citizens, using publicly available satellite tools, have been able to track a military campaign almost in real time. Accounts like OSINT Technical and the monitoring channel, Falcon Insight, have published geolocated footage placing the strikes specifically in the anchorage area north of the Kerch Strait, near the Kerch Bridge itself, showing what appear to be dozens of vessels in the area, some clearly underway, others anchored and stationary. That level of granular, independently geolocated verification is significant, because it means outside observers, journalists, and researchers don't have to rely solely on either Ukrainian military statements or Russian denials. They can cross-reference NASA's thermal imaging data, individually geolocated video footage, and statements from Russian regional officials themselves, and in this case, all 3 of those independent threads point toward the same basic conclusion. A large, sustained, and increasingly effective Ukrainian drone campaign is actively degrading Russia's ability to move fuel across the Sea of Azov into occupied Crimea. Before we wrap up, it's worth being direct about what we still don't know, because that matters just as much as what's been confirmed. We don't have independently verified figures on exactly how many of these 35 vessels were destroyed outright versus damaged and repairable. We don't have a confirmed casualty count among tanker crews, beyond Rostov's governor stating no injuries were reported in the 2 vessels struck in his region specifically. And we don't yet know how Russia intends to adapt its supply routes going forward, whether that means rerouting tankers further from the coast, adding air defense escorts, or shifting more reliance onto overland routes through the Kerch Bridge and mainland Russia instead. Those are the details worth watching in the days ahead, because they'll tell us whether this campaign forces a lasting change in how Russia supplies occupied Crimea, or whether it's a painful, but ultimately temporary disruption that Moscow finds a way to work around. There's one more piece of this story worth sitting with, because it connects everything back to the bigger picture of how this war is actually being fought in its 4th year. For a long time, discussion of Ukraine's ability to strike back at Russia focused almost entirely on Western-supplied missiles, their range restrictions, and the political debates in Washington and European capitals over what Ukraine was and wasn't allowed to hit. This Sea of Azov campaign represents something different. This is a domestically built, domestically operated drone force run by Ukraine's own unmanned systems forces using long-range naval and aerial drones developed and produced without waiting on a foreign government's approval or export licensing decision. That matters strategically, because it means this specific capability isn't subject to the same political negotiations that have slowed or limited other forms of Western military support throughout the war. When Brovdi's units decide to hit the Azov Sea Shadow Fleet 4 nights in a row, there's no Allied government sign-off required, no debate in a foreign parliament about escalation risk. That operational independence is a big part of why this campaign has been able to escalate as quickly as it has, from 2 ships on the first night to 14 by the 4th. It also says something about how the character of this war has shifted since 2022. In the early phase of the full-scale invasion, most of the dramatic battlefield stories centered on tank columns, artillery duels, and contested cities like Bakhmut or Avdiivka. 4 years in, some of the most consequential fighting is happening in a domain that barely existed as a serious battlefield when the invasion started. A drone war over open water, targeting the unglamorous but absolutely critical infrastructure of fuel logistics. Nobody puts a Shadow Fleet tanker on a recruitment poster. But if Ukraine can genuinely sever occupied Crimea's fuel and power lifelines through campaigns like this one, the practical impact on Russia's ability to sustain its southern military grouping could end up mattering just as much as any single battlefield engagement on land. That's the real story behind the burning ships in the Azov Sea. It's not just about tankers. It's about whether Ukraine can win a war of logistics, even in places where it can't yet win a war of territory. Let's go back to where we started. Right now, in the waters north of Kerch, more Russian tankers may already be burning. This operation didn't slow down after night 1 or night 2 or night 3. It built 2 ships, then 10, then 9, then 14, 35 vessels in 4 days, with satellites tracking the fires from orbit, and a Russian governor confirming the damage in his own backyard. Robert Brovdi's message throughout this campaign has been consistent and defiant. The Shadow Fleet is leaving the area. Sanctions from the sky are in effect. And in his words, delivered plainly on telegram as this operation unfolded night after night, Moscow will fall. Whether that specific prediction holds up, nobody can say with certainty this early. But the fuel crisis now gripping occupied Crimea, the blackouts, the rationing, the state of emergency, all of it is happening in real time, right now, as a direct result of this campaign in the Sea of Azov. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand just how coordinated this maritime pressure campaign actually is, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know what surprised you most. Whether it's the satellite confirmation, the scale of the 4-day total, or the state of emergency now unfolding inside occupied Crimea. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this operation as it develops, because based on the pattern of the last 4 nights, this is very likely not over yet.